Thank you very much, esteemed guests, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really honored to be able to deliver this speech. My title for the presentation differs slightly from the one in the brochure, because I think the one in the brochure is too lofty. I wanted to be a bit more humble. So today, in my presentation, seeing that the conference theme is about a learning nexus of three things: AI, neuroscience, and education, I would like to find a pathway integrating AI with the learning sciences, of which Kimberly so craftfully spoke about this morning with respect to the kinds of authentic work and contexts through which real change occurs in classrooms, and the more recent phenomena of what we call science of learning. So I come from the learning sciences tradition, very similar to what Kimberly spoke about this morning. But one of the great difficulties that we have in the learning sciences in doing the kinds of participatory designs that we find in schools is that policymakers do not always find it very scalable. In other words, you have to do design-based research at every locality with research practice partnerships in order to scale it up. So the scaling in a DBR context is not a linear process vis-a-vis from experimental designs all the way to translation in schools. So how else do you do DBR unless it's a bottom-up? Every school, every cluster of schools, every district of schools engage in a design-based research implementation process at scale. So the journey that I took on the learning sciences kind of like had significant reduced funding after a while, and because policymakers do not find it very scalable. So more recently, there is the science of learning, which is about neuroscience, about physiological layers of learning, about eye tracking devices, which could tell us other proxy indicators beyond the classroom observable ones that we have entered into such a work. In the science of learning, I would imagine it is, instead of moving towards the classroom authentic practices, is moving the other direction vis-a-vis the upstream science, so-called, of learning, that we can hopefully find new opportunities and new lenses through which we can understand the complexities underpinning learning. So I just want to say that in the last 30 years or 20 years, I have spanned from a design-based research paradigm and now moved upstream towards a more science of learning paradigm, of which I see many of you have presentations in the afternoon. So how do we reconcile all this is one of the thoughts that I have recently been thinking much about. And just to advertise a little bit, in Singapore we are coming out a book by October, November this year that basically tries to converge the science of learning, which is a very micro level of analysis, with the learning sciences, which is more design and pedagogy, with school systems change. Almost an impossible endeavor, but we are trying to compile a book where we have eminent authors from all three dimensions or three levels of learning data: science of learning, the learning sciences, and school systems change. And let's see how that progresses as we continue the dialogue in this very difficult but interesting learning nexus. So today, the talk is less about AI, but more about intelligence augmentation. So AI is artificial intelligence, but what I want to advocate is IA, intelligence augmentation, just the flip of AI, okay? And I would like to argue that intelligence augmentation is ever more crucial in today's era and advent of AI, which is spilling all over in schools, in industry, in academia, and everywhere. And I argue that the role of teachers is even more critical in the milieu of such dominance with AI than otherwise. And I want to continue to press on the moderator's point this morning that the need for school change is ever more important today than even a year back. Since the pandemic, we have been talking a lot about school change, but schools are hard to change, very, very hard to change. I think in Korea, you have your very high stakes examinations, it's like entrance exams into into this university. In Singapore, we have our national high-stakes exams at about 3 time points, and these dominate the instructional practices by and large. So school change is really difficult. With all the rhetoric we can give with respect to 21st century learning, and we're moving into 22nd century, and even all the AI, compared to the rate of change, school change is tremendously slow and difficult. Maybe in today's talk, I will then want us to position ourselves. If our goal is that schools are still so critical, teachers are ever more there and necessary to guide students, especially with all the misinformation, with all the dis-well-being, with all the need for criticality with information, I argue that school change is imperative. So I just move on and just say that since the pandemic, this call for change is ever needed in a very unpredictable, known, unknown, or unknown situations. And we haven't even gotten out of that situation. Generative AI came along, and we tried to police the way in which generative AI is used in schools and also in universities. But actually, maybe the entire assessment and task designs ought to change instead. Whether we like it or not, students are using generative AI. My children in universities use it like nobody's business, but they know how to game the system, and I hope that through the entire process, their critical thinking do not decline, but increase instead. And today, there is an increasing cycle of disengagement with schools. So what happens in schools is that there are all these initiatives from 21st century learning needs to inquiry-based learning to now the rise of AI so dominant. How do we actually change the car tires of school systems while the school required performances are still needed? So how do we do that? This is one of the things I discuss much with my class in back home when I teach a group of heads of departments, whether in technology or in the disciplinary areas, how they can manage a department where change is ever needed and yet be responsible to the kinds of things that we have in times past been successful over. So today, if you look at AI, it's not all that rosy. If you look as content experts into the content generated by ChatGPT, sometimes the nuancing is missing. But for a novice learner, these things do not come easily apparent to these learners. And so there's a dark and declining side of using such technology, very powerful as they are, but they steal away the opportunities for which teachers design an instructional process within zones of proximal development. So, as in any new emerging technology, there are pros and cons. There's the promise of AI doing auto-marking, for example, helping teachers doing lesson planning, and that's all great because it kind of like reduces the heavy teaching workload and complexities of the teaching profession and help alleviate some of these things so that teachers could spend more time with students, more time at the dialogic and facilitatory processes of classroom instruction as so desired of design-based research. But there are currently imperfections within AI, but I think these things can improve over time. But really, how would teachers use such technologies in intelligence augmentation outcomes for their students and not the other way around, where the overuse of powerful devices and technologies lower metacognition by producing laziness or cause cognitive declines? So how do we actually best, as humans and technology, augment the process? Actually, is this new? Ever since we did cognitivist tools, mind tools, David Jonathan, Young's supervisor, we have always been speaking about how humans partner with technology, right? And to produce those outcomes. But I think because technology is fast, furious, and powerful, they can be used to one's disadvantage without one knowing it. So let's therefore reinforce the notion that teachers are very important. But teachers being good designers and enablers and facilitators of learning, and not just the traditional way in which we do things. So this concept of intelligence augmentation is held by a couple of people, Chris Didi being one of them. Another one is Mutlu from UCL. And I've been working closely with them. And again, humans are very good at making judgments, all right, in context and with data. All right? Even babies can do facial recognition much better than a machine can do. These are what humans are good at, okay? Machines are computing and churning out a lot of data and things like that, even when you are sleeping, right? So if we can find a way in which humans and machines can better augment in the intelligence augmentation process, I think we are in a better state as a species of human beings. So, because Chris Didi would say that judgment comes very much in dialogue, in participatory contexts, like social cultural theories of the mind, and it performs within communities of practice, like what we are doing now, and very much like what Kimberly talked about, legitimate peripheral participation, as you look and understand what's going on in the community, not just in terms of explicit knowledge, but implicit intuitive resources that we so desire to acquire as human beings for the purposes of good judgment. So if we were to integrate today's learning sciences and the science of learning vis-a-vis neuroscience proxies, physiological proxies, and other behavioral proxies that are more implicit in nature, are we able to have science of learning to inform us on how to measure things insofar as judgment is concerned? So there is a great need for schools and teachers today to understand not just TPCK, which is very much what is known already for a decade, and teachers are not very good at TPCK even after 2 decades, by the way. And that's why we need a lot of design-based research to go into schools to work alongside teachers to co-design lessons. And instead of more funding going there, we are actually funding the other side of the spectrum. So sometimes we need to get to our policymakers and funders, what is the crux of educational change, right? So in AI that comes on board TPCK, we are now embedding on top of TPCK ethical knowledge, okay, of AI responsible use, data-informed analytics, okay? We are adding these to the teacher's literacy ability, and we need to do it quickly, right? Because teachers are hard to change, because they have other performance requirements needed in schools, like Singapore's successful school system. And I would like to recommend that we not just infuse AI, the kinds of data literacy and ethical literacy and computational thinking literacy into TPCK. We should also infuse measures of cognition, emotion, and regulation. Right at the bottom, the purple box behind, underpinning everything. Because if we were to integrate these into a good framework, then teachers and schools would not see AI as one initiative, science of learning as another initiative, technology integration, and yet a third initiative. I think they should all be seen holistically and in an integrated fashion for the betterment of classroom practices. So, ChatGPT, for example, is just a very powerful tool, or at least on perception, right? So if I draw a y-axis to y-axis on the degree of AI automation vis-a-vis the degree of human control, which we definitely want, and not let machines take over our thinking or our actions, then we can actually move along a continuum, right, from digitization of a lot of content, which ChatGPT can do very wonderfully these days, to a distributed model where, for example, you work with a GPS in order to get to a location. You don't have to internalize that GPS into you. That's what my children do all the time. They go into a car, switch on the GPS. They don't really pick up any navigational or locational cues. No, not like me. In the days I grew up, there was no GPS. I had to learn to navigate. Today, I on the GPS as an augmentation tool on the top right corner, right? And then today, we even have driverless cars, right? Totally autonomous with very little human agency needed. I mean, I drew up this graph just a few days ago. I mean, from an instructional point of view, you need to figure out what you gain and what you lose with respect to using any technology. In the days of old, we used to have a way in which we could set up system preferences within a software to prevent students from using too powerful scaffolds within a tool, so that we gradually scaffold the learning process so that the machine does not overtake what is human cognition required. Right? So in those days, we used to do that, but today, everything is given to a kid. And a tool could be used positively and not so positively, depending on the time and situation and need. I mean, my children, they hardly need to navigate, right? But if there is a breakdown, for example, the teleco system doesn't work, maybe in a situation the roads are snowy, the road is blocked, then a breakdown occurs. When a breakdown occurs, then human cognition kicks in. But in education in K-12 settings, we can better design for such gains and losses in instructional goals whenever we use a tool for instructional purposes. And these are skill sets that teachers urgently need to have. So, Steffi, my research, very capable assistant, helped me with some of these examples. This is a GPS example, right? So if you have a less powerful GPS, a teacher could use broad schematic landmarks in order to help navigational abilities, but importantly, develop spatial cognition. Right? So this is an example that teachers work within the zone of proximal development. Now, in the last 20 years, not only do teachers need to navigate TPCK, they also need to navigate formal and informal learning. Right? The US came forth with a lot of formal and informal learning, almost design-based research kinds of explorations. I wouldn't want to use the word experimentations because it connotes experimental designs. And these things have found very little traction into schools. I've done this 20 years back. We tried to do research that married the principles of informal learning into formal classrooms, but the socio-political politics behind curriculum, pedagogy, and assessments are critical things that we have not managed to solve over the years. So this is an example of how low SES kids who did not do well and were not motivated academically were able to develop scientific understandings when we worked together in partnerships with the Science Center and with practitioners in industry out there, together with teachers, to design science inquiry that were motivating for these low SES students with more challenging learning situations. But importantly, we wanted the teachers in the schools to internalize and appropriate the kinds of designs that they picked up with other practitioners, because we knew that after a while, after our funding ends, such opportunities may not persist. So we wanted to create a school-wide ecosystem that would be able to sustain these efforts after research funding ends. So I just want to show you a simple Vygotskian approach where the learner or the learner and the environment is interacting with a much more complex environment these days. Tools abundant through app stores, right? But within the middle is the very important role of a parent or a teacher or a coach, right? And there is a need for, therefore, a human in the loop for the teacher to design and enable and facilitate interactions with designed learning outcomes, and for the learner to increasingly internalize some of these things in order to become self-directed learners, whether they work in a distributed context or they work in a context for which they are lacking in the tools or otherwise, the other extreme, right? So there are three significant barriers to any innovation. This conference is about educational innovations, and this is nothing new, right? It's in the literature for a long time. Access, right? So one of the most fundamental things we can do is access to technology, hardware and equipment. So recently in Singapore, secondary school students from grade 7 onwards all have a personal learning device. Now, we were very slow in some of these things because when we give a tool or technology to a student, there's the good and the bad and the ugly side of everything that is accessible via the technology. How do we actually scaffold that learning process so much so that the learner is now independent and self-directed with respect to honest and ethical and purposeful pursuits, right? The other is the design competency of teachers, but finally the most difficult is the socio-technical infrastructure. The timetabling periods in a school do not change easily. The way lessons are structured in the last 20 to 30 years do not change easily, because disciplines and subjects in schools are kind of compartmentalized in a non-interdisciplinary fashion. How do we solve many of these things? Because if we cannot solve these things, including funding resourcing and other human expertise to be able to move from a frontal instructionistic approach to a constructivistic inquiry approach, much of our research will not find sustainability. So this is an example of a design-based research that we did like 10 years ago. It was the days where portable devices just started, and it was funded from an industry player. And we had, instead of a school working by themselves, because we understood that a school is under-resourced for a new pedagogy. So we wanted to solve the problem at a larger level of analysis. We brought together a cluster of schools, because in a cluster level, we could share teacher competence and teacher expertise. At a cluster of schools, we could share not just human resource, but technological devices to lend to each other. At a cluster of schools, we could leverage on other experienced teachers who have gone through the journey and to apprentice those who have not. So in this picture here, it is primary school teachers from a number of schools coming together 2 by 2, being apprenticed by a teacher who has done this inquiry-based seamless learning project some time back. And then these teachers came back to their respective schools, convinced their own heads of departments that they needed to change their departmental scheme of work in order to infuse this so-called alien pedagogy into their respective schools. And then, in a very difficult but challenging but rewarding way, the class is a lot messier than classroom tables, and these teachers were behind mentoring and advising and providing feedback for this new changed pedagogy. So this is what I call socio-technological infrastructural change. The powers at hand at the department within the school needs to be legitimized by the cluster soup and school leaders to want to change. And then at the cluster level, they had a plan of action over 3 to 5 years to move this pedagogy from one subject to another. Without school leaders involved in this entire process, no sustaining will ever happen. If it does, it takes much longer than what change is required in today's times. Right? So these 3 dimensions are very critical to sustain any change. Okay, so this is part 1 of my talk. I got 3 parts. I'm almost done with my time. But I want to say that now that AI has come along, how do we situate AI, the integration of AI into TPCK, into current school practices? Okay, this is the key question to me. The end outcome determines the process that leads to that end outcome. Whether we are doing science of learning, or whether we are doing the learning sciences, or both. Or whether we are trying to align all the different layers of data from neuroscience to physiological sciences to behavioral sciences to cognition and so on and so forth. I'm not sure what's happening to the screen, but doesn't matter. So I argue that AI is not just something that we need to conceptualize as a framework, which is what Mutlu and others have done with UNESCO framework. This is the 2 things that I want to focus on: AI pedagogy and AI for professional development. And I want to say that AI for professional development is insufficient. You need the kind of design-based research, AI, TPCK, embedded within schools, and to sustain it at the school level or at the school cluster level. Right, so I argue that that's still insufficient because today we need to integrate the science of learning that could give us intelligence augmentation proxies beyond the narrowly constrained defines of IQ, right? Testing. And we need to integrate, because science of learning gives us a developmental lifespan understanding of how the child or the adolescent or the older adolescent performs in terms of neuroscience understandings with respect to technology use and any other learning that we want to hope to achieve, both in terms of cognition and emotional regulation. And then we need to situate the learning sciences and educational change into the entire process. So in complement to that framework that UNESCO came out, I would like to propose 3 levels for which change can occur in schools. So if at the knowledge level, of which we are very good at university and bringing teachers into literacy programs, we can integrate both AI and the science of learning. And science of learning has got all the interleaved practices, spaced repetition and things like that, which could be complemented with other design-based research, learning sciences principles, for which we can then help teachers to familiarize themselves with actual task designs that we could do within class time at the NIE. But the difficulty about the teacher education institution is that it doesn't have the opportunity to go down to the schools, which must be a subsequent follow-up with respect to real change and sustainable structures of the socio-technological infrastructure. So at the design and pedagogy, we could leverage on the many good examples through which humans and machines can be in augmentation modalities with potentially even AI-embodied experiences, because I believe very much that the premium today is in embodiment, okay? And then we could also therefore leverage on student agency and feedback, because today these tools like ChatGPT or generative AI can democratize student access, but student agency and the criticality to thinking is a precondition before such democratization gets out of control. So in terms of educational change, the first two are important but not enough. We need to then use our understandings of school structures and change in order to sustain what happens at the classroom, at the school, and hopefully also at the school-to-school networks level. So I just want to say, to show you back this important diagram, that's very important that children become self-directed by internalizing the zones of proximal development experiences that teachers afford to them, and teachers being designers, enablers, and facilitators, these also become internalized so that in an exploded environment of apps, tools, and access to such things, students would become more self-directed, learning to navigate between digitization to distributed models, to augmentation models, and also to autonomous models when they have picked up the learning outcomes needed for the earlier three. So some examples of using and not fearing generative AI is that teachers could engage students with such experiences, but engage them with much more thoughtful exercises and reflection, not just individually, but collaboratively. Even Gen AI could be a collaborative distributed agent in terms of a collaborative process, and analyze the prompts that students generate, because the prompts gives us a proxy to whether critical thinking has happened. Now, AI, I was told, is also now increasingly built into robots in embodied behavior. So today, I'm asked to come up with projects that get the robots to model gestorial actions of teachers. Okay, gestorial actions of teachers. And then these robots become teacher assistants in classrooms. But how do we validate those gestorial models? Because gestures is such a spontaneous, intuitive activity. We are trying to make the intuitive explicit, and then computationally model it in robots, and then use the robots within the instructional teaching and learning environment. I'm doing all this today, and yet the basic problem of school change hasn't changed very much. You understand the difficulty we are faced with? We need to do both ends well, the school end and the upstream end, okay? And then we need to bring integration into all three. So my hypothesis is that in schools, if we want to make this to work, my own observations of school teachers in the last 10 years is that they are overworked, they have not much motivation to change, apart from the top 1% or top 10%, and they have to cope with the demand of parents who want the kids to do very well for examinations. Teachers need cognitive flexibility, if I were to just infuse neuroscience right now. And they need to have cognitive flexibility, differentiating learner needs, formal and informal learning opportunities, and convincing school structures for socio-technological change. Now, we know in neuroscience, or at least I was told by many of my colleagues, that we do have a science that can understand cognitive flexibility, why some individuals are more adaptive compared to others, all right? And this inferior frontal junction, supported by the networks around it, including executive functioning, is very crucial to cognitive flexibility. Now, in the past, I would then try all this research on students themselves, and then later, after the research ends, it doesn't scale, right? It might not scale, because cognitive flexibility is much more difficult in an authentic environment vis-a-vis an experimental design. I switch my mind around. Now I start working on teachers and not on students. Because if I can get the teachers right, and then the School of Education programs in which I work in, together with my colleagues, can get those two pieces right, we can then bring those pieces down to schools, right? And then we have a higher chance of getting this distributed model working for school change within schools. So, to cut a long story short, I have no time to explain to you the science behind cognitive flexibility, but I think it goes beyond experimental design, because in a real-life context situation, teachers need context switching, differentiated needs, switching of different learners, and importantly, knowing how to position themselves with different role performances. So science of learning probably cannot exist in its methodological fashion on its own. It needs to work with other interdisciplinary sciences, including education, to figure out how cognitive flexibility can be something more engendered in teachers. Okay? So where I am right now in the university I'm in, attempts even to figure out how we can transform a classroom situation where teachers, instead of the 40 students in a classroom, come to a much more narrowly constrained setting for which something like simulations, like game-based learning, can be used in this. To this end, I recommend training in cognitive flexibility with the kinds of classroom and individual learning analytics that can be afforded. All right? But I want to say that that's blue sky. What my heart goes out is much more fundamental. Okay? If we can, instead of targeting students, there are so many students out there, right? And target the lesser number of teachers and infuse these three important tenets, AI, TPCK, science of learning data as a way to inform evidence of practice, and change of socio-technical infrastructures, including new ones that would be afforded in the 21st century, and in order to produce augmentation, then we want to create the kinds of research practice partnerships, right? So how do we create research practice partnerships? At the NRE, where I come from, the Ministry of Education has given us a whole team of research scientists. Imagine that we have a systemic plan like this, and instead of research scientists deriving their own funded projects, we deploy many of these educational research scientists across the different strategic localities in Singapore, in the different clusters, and enact this program, translating NIE's AI Science of Learning Literacy programs, not just at the NIE, but implemented in school clusters, just like the work that we showed you earlier, and then systematically document the kinds of evidences for change at every hub locality within the country. Now, probably we can do it better in Singapore because we are a small centralized system of only 320 schools, thereabout. Okay? And we have a cluster system that's coordinated at the Ministry of Education. Imagine if we can align funding, align the human resources that are given for research to practice with the practitioners in schools in this partnership that is sustainable, informed by both the learning sciences and the science of learning. And the only, in NIU, we are the only school of education, we haven't even got a second one. If we can align these systemic processes up, there is a higher chance in which we can bring the learning sciences, the science of learning, to educational change with sustainability in schools. So to this end, I did not argue for AI, I argued for intelligence augmentation. Thank you very much. I think this is my last slide.